Nice to see you all. Welcome, Evie. Josie. Charlie, how are you? Thanks for coming, Nathan. Well, today we're going to be talking about ancestors and our heritage. You know, when we talk about heritage, we often think of our ancestors. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my ancestors. And this is and there's also a story, it's a story that comes from our own tradition, and it's a true story. But when I was young, probably about your age, I used to go and see my paternal gran, my dad's mother, and she used to knit a lot. So does anyone here knit? I know Laurie has even got a book. You knit? My daughter's learning to knit, but she crochets. You know, if we crochet, you use one needle, and knitting you use two. But my gran used to knit, and she used to knit me a lot of sweaters and scarf. But she'd always like to have me help. And when I say help, what I would do there, I would sit across from my gran, put my hands like that, and she'd just put the wool on me and just wrap it round so that the wool was kind of unraveled. So I would just sit there for about 2 hours with my gran while she knitted. And sometimes I'd even got that wrong. She's going, "You're not doing it right." And she'd tell me, I said, "I'm just holding your wool that you gave me." But this is also a story from our tradition about someone who knitted. And it's a story of this young girl. And she had two dads. And one of her dad's mothers was coming to stay with them, because she was a little frail. She had some illness, and she was coming to stay. And this young girl was not happy about having her gran come to stay. And she was talking to a teacher about it and said, "Why don't you want your gran to come to stay? I know your gran, she's really nice." She said, "Well, I don't want another adult telling me what to do." Could probably relate to that. And so she said, "Well, you know, your gran's probably a bit nervous about coming to stay with you as well. Maybe you could do something nice to make sure she feels welcome." And so she said, I'll make her a card." So she made this card, and she drew a picture of the house, and drew her two dads, and drew her gran arriving, and she drew herself being really happy about it. Even though she wasn't happy, she wanted her gran to feel she was happy. And so when she arrived, her gran came, and she arrived, and she was unpacking in the room, and the young girl went into the room and said, "I made this card for you because I really want you to feel welcome here." And the gran said, "Oh, that's so nice, because I was a little bit concerned that I might be imposing on your dads and yourself." And the daughter said, "No, I'm really excited to do it." She said, "Well, I wanted to give you a gift to welcome, since I was arriving, but I thought we could make it together." And the young girl went, "Really? We could make it together? How are we going to do that?" She goes, "Well, you can help me knit. I'm going to teach you to knit and crochet, and we can make this blanket together, because I know you like to sit and watch TV, but I thought we could make this blanket, and we could put it over your legs when you're kind of sitting watching TV." And so the two of them spent hours and hours just sitting there, knitting together. And I remember when I was sitting with my gran, we'd talk and have conversations, because sometimes it's easier to talk to people when you're doing something, rather than, "Let's have a conversation now." That's a little bit awkward. But if you're actually doing something, it can be a little easier. So I would talk to my gran quite a lot, and I got to know her quite well. And this young girl got to know her gran quite well. And she got this beautiful blanket, and she chose the colour of the wool because green was her favourite colour. She had this beautiful green blanket, and it became her favourite blanket. And she ended up being really pleased her gran was there. But what happened was she took the blanket everywhere. And you know what happens when you take a blanket everywhere? Well, it could break, but sometimes you lose things. You lost things. I actually lost a tie on the way to church today. There was a time, I had to take it up to a thing on Saturday, and I was taking it to the car, and by the time I got to the car, it was a red tie that my dad gave me for my brother's wedding. Yeah, so that was a kind of big loss to lose, because I was at a colleague's ordination yesterday up in Sonoma, and I was wearing that tie, because I always wear that tie for special occasions, and I lost it. And my wife was looking for it, but I lost it. But this young girl lost this blanket that she absolutely loved, and she didn't want to tell her gran about it, but she went and told her gran about I'm sorry I lost the blanket that I loved, and I really loved it, and I really enjoyed making it with you. And the Gran said, that's okay, the blanket was a nice gift, but you know what the best gift was? It was the time we had together making the blanket. And I think we need to remember that. We get very obsessed with things like blankets and ties, but the best thing is the time we have together. And especially with your family, remember, really value the time you have with each other, because it really is one of the most precious things we have. I'd like to start with a poem called A House Called Tomorrow by Albert Rios, who was the Poet Laureate of Arizona. You are not 15, or 12, or 17. You're 100 wild centuries and 15. Bringing with you in every breath and in every step everyone who has come before you. All the yous that you have been, the mother of your mother, the father of your fathers. If someone in your family tree was trouble, 100 were not. The bad do not win, not finally. No matter how loud they are, we simply would not be here if that were so. You are made fundamentally from the good. With this knowledge, you never march alone. You are breaking news of the century. You are the good who has come forward. Through it all, even if so many days feel otherwise, think, when you were a child and learned to speak, it's not that you did not know the words. It's that from the centuries, you knew so many. And it's hard to choose the words that will be your own. From those centuries, we human beings bring with us the simple solutions and songs, the river bridges and star charts and song harmonies, all in the service to a simple idea, that we can make a house called tomorrow. What we bring finally into the new day, every day, is ourselves. And that's all we need. To start, that's everything we require to keep going. Look back only for as long as you must. Then go forward into the history that you will make. Be good, then better. Write books, cure disease, make us proud. Make yourself proud. And those who came before you. When you hear thunder, hear it as their applause. Those are the words of Albert Rios. Love that line, you are made fundamentally from the good. Though I struggle with that, because one of my families, my dad's cousin who was living in New Jersey, did a trace of a family tree. And he stopped when he found out that 3 of my relatives were hung for sheep stealing. He didn't think it was going to get better from that point onwards. And I want to confess here, I've never stolen a sheep in my life. But family heritages are complicated. I mean, Liz, in a really powerful and beautiful reflection, talked about a heritage she has. It can be difficult, and even in this day and age, and especially in this day and age. I invite you all to reflect on your own family heritage. What are the stories that you're proud of that inspire you? And what are the stories that are a little bit uncomfortable? I know many in the United States, when they trace their heritage back, they find out about slave owning. Perhaps you've got some sheep stealers in your family heritage as well. Or cattle rustling. I look at my own family heritage. And I've told this before, but I think it bears repeating. I remember my gran's 80th birthday. One of her brothers was there, who'd spent his life down the coal mine from 14 till 65, 51 years down the coal mine. And this was in 1980, and I just finished my first semester in college. No, it's 1979. It was coming into the new year, 1980. Finished my first semester in college, and I was talking to my Uncle Jai, who I liked, really smart, really interesting guy, well-read guy, having spent his whole life down the mines. He was a passionate reader. And I said to him, having naively finishing my first semester in college, you know, sometime I would like to go down the mines. And he looked at me, and I remember to this day, I was taller than him, which is not uncommon. I'm taller than most things. And he put his hands on my shoulder and looked me in the eye and said, "We did not send you to college to go down the mine. We did not send you to college to go down the mine." And it was that sense of representing a community, a family beyond, you know, my own self-interest. That's one of the more inspiring ones. My dad, you know, looked at me, and none of my parents went to college. My dad wanted me to become a doctor because I was good at science. All my mum ever wanted me to do was eat more, because she thought if I ate, I'd feel better. I think the other big influence in my ancestors or my family was my brother, because he was 5 years older. So he had to do all the pioneering stuff and clear the path out for me that I could just follow along quite easily. You know, he went to college first, I could just follow him. But he was really interested in art and music. So he really helped us both kind of break away from our parents. And I realized that he made things easy for me. I'm not sure I could have broken away and done the things I did without my brother Alistair. But I think when I look for my biggest influence, it's probably not individuals. It was the environment that I grew up in. As most of you, or many of you know, I grew up in an industrial town. It was a coal mining town where the coal mine had closed. There was high unemployment. And when I look back at what that taught me, that environment taught me, it was the dehumanizing aspects of unemployment, particularly to men at that time. Because mines were a place that was mainly men working. But the other thing I really recognized was the total lack of compassion of the capitalist system that we have, and the lack of understanding of the real hardship people experience by our politicians. This capitalist system and the lack of compassion from both the capitalist system and politicians was something that struck to me, because what happens is real suffering has a dehumanizing effect, and I realize that aspect of dehumanizing has probably driven me into the ministry that I do now, and it certainly drove me to Unitarian Universalism, where we really put the love of all humanity at the center of our religion. Because there's so much in our culture that dehumanizes. We see it with the Israel-Gaza, we see it with the conflict in Ukraine, we see it with the demonizing of politics on both sides of the aisle in this country. We must stop the dehumanization of others. I also recognized in the environment I grew up was that the powerlessness that people feel towards large systems. It's something we all struggle with. What good can I do in Israel, Gaza? What good can I do resisting the capitalist system? What good can I do in changing our political system? What good can I do to preserve democracy? We all struggle with this feeling of powerlessness. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, said, "I became aware of the fateful links between me and my ancestors. I feel very strongly that I am under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which have not yet been answered. Or as I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished." Those are the words of Carl Jung. But our ancestors we often think of as a family, but I want to explore something different today. What about our spiritual, our religious ancestors? What about the forebearers of Unitarian Universalism? What did they start that's unfinished? What vision did they have that's unfinished? Because our ancestors, those who influence us, those who we choose to influence us, are far beyond our family of origin. And as I mentioned, I kind of struggle with the idea of ancestors being individuals. Because what we tend to do with those that were very influential is we tend to put them in a pedestal. And once you're in the pedestal, the only thing you can do is fall off. Because no one is perfect. And it can be disappointing when those that we value disappoint us. And one of my practices in ministry is modeling imperfection. Because imperfection is the sweet spot of my skill set. And I wonder how my ancestors look at me. Good job with imperfection, Brian. That hymn that we sang, We Are 1051, it says, we are my grandmother's prayers. Sorry, I'm going to get some water, excuse me. We are my grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. I love that, the breath of our ancestors, because breath gives life. So much of the Hebrew scriptures, God creates humans by breathing air into us. We are the breath of our ancestors, Spirit of God, lovers of life, makers of peace and wisdom of ages. I love that song. And Liz was saying during the tech rehearsal, that song is an earworm. May it be so, and may the words be earworms to us as well. But I want to talk, we often think of a family of origin being hugely influential. I want to talk about the origin of Unitarian and Universalist traditions. Because I think it's a powerful story, and a story that keeps unfolding within us even 230 years later. Our Unitarians actually came from the Congregationalists. They were in the liberal wing of the Congregationalists. And they were named Unitarian as a pejorative by the more orthodox, but we were the kind of liberal wing of the Congregationalists. And people say, well, it was an argument about the Trinity and the identity of God and Jesus. It wasn't about that, in my view, when I read the history. It was about how much diversity of thought could you have within one movement. Could you have different perspectives? At that time in the early 19th century, there was a lot of biblical worship that was questioning miracles, which can seem kind of interesting to us now, but there was a lot of scholarship saying these miracles can't be true. But our liberal Congregationalists, the Unitarians who formed the movement in 1819, they were actually saying, no, this idea of diversity of religious thought, bringing in Eastern religions, is a really good thing. It can only enrich us, whereas the more orthodox said no. And eventually the Unitarians broke away. So you see right at the beginning of the Unitarian movement was this idea of the diversity of thought and the use of reason to understand the human condition. And those are still with us today. Those are at the very core of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. Now the Universalists were a kind of different group. The Universalists grew out the liberal wing of the Baptists, which may come as a little bit of a shock to some of us. And they grew up with a kind of idea in the 18th century, and the idea was universal salvation. That's where Universalists come from. And the idea, the general Christian orthodoxy at the time, and remember both Unitarian and Universalists grew out of Christianity, The general Orthodox Christianity at the time was that, well, a small amount of people will be saved and go to heaven, and most people will serve eternity in hell. Now, of course, 200 years, for the last 200 years, we've given up any idea of the literal heaven and hell. But the Universalists kind of really shifted that idea from the punishing God to a loving God. And that was a powerful shift that the Universalists did. But the other thing, by saying, the Universalists said, no, all people will go to heaven. Some right away, some later, but everyone will go to heaven. And this gave humanity a common human destiny. And by giving humanity a common human destiny, it created this radical egalitarianism. This idea that we will all equal. We have this common destiny. And you hear that, that idea of radical egalitarianism and that idea of a loving God is central to who we are now. We put the love of all humanity at the center of our religion, and we work through justice to create more equality. So right at the origins of the Unitarians and the Universalists are these fundamental tenets that still live with us today. And I think what we're trying to do and what we owe our ancestors, and probably more important, what we owe our descendants is, how do we want to create a religion for the 21st century? How do we want to create a religion for the 21st century? I think a lot of it is about being in right relationships with ourselves, our ideals, being in right relationships with the communities that we're involved in, being in right relationship with the planet, and being in right relationship with the divine or the sacred as we understand it. And that, I believe, is a religion for the 21st century. That's what we owe our ancestors, continuing that idea of bringing reason, that idea of bringing diversity of thought, that idea of radical egalitarianism, and that idea of centering it in love. That's what we owe our ancestors who created us, and that's what we owe our descendants. Religion should challenge our biases, not confirm them, and too much of religion just confirms people's biases. You look at how so much of mainstream religion is critical of transgenders, who's critical of people of colour, who justify slavery, who are critical of homosexuals. So much of it is, and we cannot let religion confirm our own biases. Religion at its best should always be challenging our biases, to be more loving, to be more caring, to be more compassionate, and to work towards greater equality. There's a beautiful Greek idea. It's called the gaze of eternity. And it says, we should live our lives looking at all the great people that we respect, all those great people I love, all our family members. We should live life as if they're watching us. Okay, it's a bit of a creepy idea as well, but but it's a really powerful idea of all the great people we're looking at, watching us. How would we behave, and how do we want to act in front of them? But I want to twist that a little bit. Yeah, all the great people of the past. But what about those descendants? How do we want to live so that they see us? How do we want to live now so those in the future can see us? Because eternity is not just the past, it's the future as well. And I want to present a question to you, because one of the things I always like to think about is, what will people today, what will people in 50 years' time look back at and think, what were you thinking? Because we look back 50 years and think, what were they thinking? What were they thinking that women didn't have the same equality as men? What were they thinking that homosexuality was wrong? What were they thinking that African Americans and people of colour don't have the same rights? What were they thinking that mental health was just a character flaw and not an illness? And I have to say, when I looked at that, I've been asking that question every decade since I was about 20, and my answer's changed in the last 10 years. Right now, with the events of the last 10 years, like, why didn't you do something about fascism? Why didn't you do something about the attacks on democracy? Why didn't you do something for a criminal justice system that's prejudiced against African Americans? I invite you to think, what in 50 years' time will people look back at and think, what were you thinking? Because that's what we owe our descendants, the future generations, the children that were up here. 50 years' time, they'll be late 50s, early 60s. What are they going to think about what we did now? Many of us love our seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are part. And we think of that independent web across space, that what happens in Israel and Gaza impacts us, what happens in Ukraine impacts us, what happens in neighborhoods in San Francisco and San Jose impact us. Therefore, we have a responsibility. But I want to extend that idea of the interdependent web of all existence across time, to the past and the future. That's part of the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are part. We are part of history, we're part of the future. How do we want history to remember us? Because the world, I don't want to leave this world that we currently have to the generations to come in 50 years' time. I want to turn that world around. I want to improve that world. I want to change it. There's a lot we need to address. And I believe our Unitarian Universalist faith calls us to act. Salvation is here and now. It's not otherworldly. Salvation is what we do today, what we do next week, what we do next month, what we do next year. That is where salvation is. That's why we work for justice. That's why we work on being in right relationships with ourselves, right relationship with each other, right relationship with the planet, and right relationship with the divine as we understand it. So I invite you, how do you want to be remembered in 50 years' time? And then start living to make that a reality.